My son forgot my graduation. I forgot his wedding gift. The envelope sat in the center of the gift table, fat and white and sealed, my return address written in careful cursive in the upper left corner. 200 guests moved through the ballroom behind me, champagne flutes catching the chandelier light, a string quartet playing something Vivaldi adjacent near the entrance. Kristen's mother had spent 14 months planning this wedding. The centerpieces alone, Kristen had mentioned at Thanksgiving, with the casual precision of someone making sure you understood the gap between your worlds, had cost more than my monthly pension check. I'd smiled and said they were beautiful. They were. That part was true. I sat at the family table in the pale blue dress I'd bought at Macy's 2 weeks earlier, the one the saleswoman had called elegant and age-appropriate, and I watched my son Daniel move through the room with the easy confidence of a man who has never once questioned whether he belongs somewhere. He shook hands, he laughed at the right moments, he put his arm around Kristen's waist and she turned toward him, and they looked from across the ballroom like a photograph already framed and hung on a wall, like something finished and perfect and sealed behind glass. There was a white envelope on that gift table with my name in the return address corner. Inside was a card. On the card was a single sentence written in my steadiest handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who spent 39 years taking precise notes on patient charts in the middle of the night when her hands were steady from sheer professional necessity. The sentence said, "I simply forgot." No signature, no explanation, no apology. Just those 3 words which I had borrowed, without alteration, from a text message my son had sent me 7 months earlier. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is not where this story begins. This story begins much more quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, in a folding chair with a paper placard taped to the armrest that said "Reserved" in block letters I had printed myself. My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 68 years old. I was a registered nurse for 39 years, the last 22 of them in the cardiac care unit at St. Augustine's Medical Center, where I worked nights because nights paid better and because Daniel had been in school during the days and someone had to be awake when he came home. I raised him alone. His father left when Daniel was 4, which was hard, and then his father died when Daniel was 19, which was complicated in the way that losses are always complicated when the grief and the anger have nowhere clean to go. I did not date again for a long time. I did not have the bandwidth, and then, gradually, I did not have the habit. What I had instead was work and Daniel and a small house in Glendale with a garden I kept up on weekends, and a persistent, quiet ambition that I had been carrying since I was 22 years old and dropped out of my first nursing program because I was pregnant and broke and terrified. I always meant to go back and finish my degree. Not the nursing credential, I had that, the practical certifications, the 39 years of evidence that I knew what I was doing. I mean the actual bachelor's degree, the cap and gown, the diploma in the frame, the thing that would mean I had done it properly, completely, all the way to the end. I'd started 3 times over the years and stopped each time for practical reasons. Money, Daniel's school schedule, my mother's health, the rotating series of crises that constitute a life lived on a single income with no safety net. Each time I stopped, I told myself, later, next year, when things settle down. Things settle down differently than you expect them to. Not all at once, not cleanly. But in the summer, when I turned 66 and retired from St. Augustine's, I sat in my garden on the first morning I didn't have to be anywhere, with a cup of coffee and the specific silence of a house that is entirely your own. And I thought, now, right now, before I talk myself out of it again. I enrolled in the degree completion program at Glendale Community College that September. It took 11 months. It was one of the hardest things I'd done since the early years of single parenthood. Not because the coursework was beyond me. I had decades of practical experience that made the theoretical material feel almost familiar, like meeting someone you'd known through letters. But because studying at 66 requires a particular kind of stubbornness. Your brain is not the same machine it was at 22. You have to fight for retention in ways you didn't have to fight before. You read a chapter, and then you read it again. And then you write notes in the margins. And then the next morning, you review the notes. And some of it is stuck, and some of it has slipped away overnight, like water through a cupped palm. You learn to be patient with yourself in ways nobody tells you you'll need to learn. Daniel knew I was doing it. I told him the first week over the phone because he lived 40 minutes away in Silver Lake with Kristen, and they had what I understood to be a busy life. He'd said, "That's great, Mom," in the tone he reserved for news that was good but not urgent. The same tone he used when I told him I'd had a good checkup at the doctor, or that the garden was coming in nicely this year. Warm, brief, filed away. I didn't push for more. I understood that my small victories did not always have room in his larger life, and I had made my peace with that understanding gradually, the way you make peace with most things, by deciding one morning to stop fighting it. The graduation ceremony was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in May. The college held it at the Civic Auditorium, which seated about 800 people and smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and old upholstery in the particular way that public buildings always do. I'd gotten my tickets in March, 2 of them, because that was the family allotment per graduate, and I had called Daniel in the first week of March with the date, the time, the parking information, and the seat number for the reserved chair I was arranging through the Disability Services office for his bad knee. Tuesday the 14th at 2 o'clock, I said. "I've got it, Mom," he said. "I'll be there." I wrote it down in the small notebook I kept by the phone, the way I'd always written things down. Daniel, graduation, May 14th, 2 p.m., Civic Auditorium. I drew a small star next to it. I am not a woman who draws stars next to things. But this felt like a star occasion. I spent April buying the blue dress, the low heels that I broke in by wearing them around the house for 3 weeks so my feet wouldn't ache during the ceremony. I got my hair done the week before. My friend Ruth, who I'd worked with for 15 years at St. Augustine's before she retired, drove me to the salon and sat reading a magazine while Loretta cut and colored. And when I came out, Ruth looked up and said, "Margaret, you look like someone who's about to do something worth doing." I had to look away for a moment because my eyes had gone embarrassing on me. The morning of the 14th, I was up at 7. I put on the dress and the heels and the cap and gown over the dress because I wanted to see the full effect in the mirror, and I stood there in my bathroom for a moment, looking at the woman in the black robe with the mortarboard and the tassel, and I felt something I don't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, something deeper and older than pride, something that had been waiting a long time. Ruth picked me up at noon. We got there early, as I prefer, and found our section, and I identified the reserved chair with its paper placard, and I sat down next to it, and I set my purse on the seat to hold it, and then I sat with my hands folded and my back straight, and I waited for 2 o'clock. The ceremony began at 2:15, delayed in the way of all ceremonies. The auditorium filled, the faculty processed in, robes and regalia, which I found unexpectedly moving. The chairs around me filled with family members and friends, and the ordinary comfortable noise of people who are together for a good occasion. The chair next to me stayed empty. I moved my purse to the floor at 2:10 because I assumed Daniel was running late. He had always run late. From the time he was a teenager, punctuality had been a value he respected in theory and ignored in practice. And I had spent years being frustrated by this, and then years accepting it, and then years simply accounting for it, the way you account for weather. The ceremony was lovely. I want to say that clearly. They called our names alphabetically, and we walked across the stage and shook the dean's hand and took our diplomas and came back down the other side. And when they called Margaret Ann Calloway, I walked up those steps with my shoulders back and my head up, the way my mother had taught me. And I shook the dean's hand and I took the diploma, the real one, the leather-covered one. And I walked back down and I did not look at the empty chair. Ruth photographed everything. She had borrowed her daughter's good camera for the occasion, and she photographed the procession and the handshake and the moment I came back to my seat and the official group photographs afterward. She printed the best one later and framed it for me. Me in my black gown and mortarboard, diploma held in both hands, looking directly at the camera with an expression I didn't recognize as my own until I'd studied it for a while. I looked in that photograph like a woman who had finished something. My phone buzzed in my purse during the recessional. I fished it out and read the message while the music played and the graduates filed past. "Mom, something came up at work. So sorry. We'll call later." I put the phone back in my purse. Ruth's hand found my arm briefly, a quick pressure, and then she let go and didn't say anything, which was the correct choice and the reason Ruth has been my closest friend for 22 years. Later that night, after the dinner Ruth had taken me to, a nice Italian place she'd chosen deliberately, with candles and cloth napkins, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, and I did the thing I was not supposed to do, which was look at Instagram. Kristen had posted that evening 3 photographs. A restaurant I recognized as Nobu in West Hollywood, which I knew because Daniel had taken me there on my birthday 2 years prior, and mentioned the prices with a kind of pride I had tried to share genuinely. In the photographs, Daniel and Kristen, Kristen's parents, Kristen's sister and her husband, a table full of food and wine and candlelight, and the specific brightness of people who are having a good time they are also performing for the camera. The caption said, "Family dinner celebrating big news. So grateful for this crew." The timestamp on the first photograph was 3:47 in the afternoon. The graduation ceremony had ended at 3:20. I put my phone face down on the garden table and sat for a moment listening to the neighborhood sounds. A dog somewhere, a car passing on the street, the faint music from the Garcia's back patio 3 houses over. The wine glass was still in my hand. I set it down carefully on the table next to the phone, and I looked at the bougainvillea along the back fence, which was blooming aggressively this year, pink-purple in the fading evening light, the color of something that refuses to be subtle about existing. I thought, he wasn't at work. I thought, he was at dinner. I thought, he made a choice, and the choice was not me, and then he lied to me about why. I sat with that for a long time. The wine went warm. The Garcia's music changed to something slower. The dog stopped barking. Across the yard, the bougainvillea held its color in the dark until it didn't anymore, until it was just a shape against the fence. And then I stood up and brought the glass inside and washed it carefully and put it away, and I went to bed. He called 3 days later, not the same night, 3 days later, on a Friday evening, and the quality of his voice when I answered had the particular brightness of a person who has convinced himself that the interval of time is long enough to function as erasure. I recognized that brightness. I had heard it from patients' families before. The voice of someone who needs the crisis to be over and has decided, unilaterally, that it is. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the Glendale News Press crossword, which I do in pen because I've been doing it in pen since 1987 and I see no reason to change. The diploma was propped against the fruit bowl in its leather cover, where I'd set it the night I came home from the ceremony and hadn't moved it since. I looked at it when he spoke. "Mom, hey, how are you? Listen, I am so sorry about Tuesday. Work was completely insane. There was a client situation that blew up right before I was supposed to leave, and I just could not get away. I felt terrible about it. How was the ceremony? Ruth sent me a photo of you on the stage. You look incredible, honestly." I set the pen down very carefully, parallel to the edge of the newspaper. "It was lovely," I said. "They called my name, and I walked across the stage, and I shook the dean's hand, and they gave me the diploma." "That's so great, Mom. Seriously, I'm really proud of you. And I'm so sorry I missed it. I really am." There was a quality to the apology that I had learned to recognize over 40 years of nursing and 20 years of single parenthood. The apology that wants to be received more than it wants to be true. It is not a dishonest apology exactly. The person saying it does feel something, but what they feel is primarily the discomfort of being in the wrong, and the apology is aimed at relieving that discomfort rather than addressing the wrong itself. I had given those apologies myself in my time. I knew the texture of them. "Work has just been so intense lately," he said, filling the silence I was allowing to sit there. "This client, I won't bore you with the details, but it was genuinely a situation where I had no choice. You understand." "I understand that you had no choice," I said, which was true and also not the same as saying I believed it. Another beat. He shifted gears with the practiced smoothness of someone who has learned that momentum is better than stillness when a conversation is going somewhere uncomfortable. "So listen, there's actually something else I wanted to talk to you about. Something good. We have some news." I waited. "Kristen and I are engaged," he said. "We're getting married." The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Through the window above the sink, I could see the bougainvillea starting to go deep pink in the early evening, the way it does when the light hits it from the west. I had planted that bougainvillea the year Daniel started middle school, because I'd read that they were hard to kill and I needed something in my life that was hard to kill. I set my pen down on the crossword and looked at the question I'd been working on before he called. 11 letters. The clue was, what remains when everything else is stripped away? I hadn't figured it out yet. "That's wonderful news, Daniel," I said. "I'm very happy for you both. When did you ask her?" "Last weekend. We went to Santa Barbara. I had the ring. It was this whole thing. She cried. It was perfect." Last weekend. While I was sitting in my garden with warm wine and looking at Instagram photographs taken 3 hours after my graduation ceremony. He had been ring shopping while I was walking across a stage with an empty chair in the family section. "It sounds beautiful," I said. "She must be so happy." "She really is. Her mom is already deep in planning mode. You know how Barbara is." He laughed, easy and comfortable, the laugh of a man in the middle of something good. "It's going to be a big wedding. October, we're thinking. Next year. We'll get you all the details soon." "Of course," I said. "Congratulations, sweetheart." After I hung up, I sat for a long moment with the phone face down on the table and my hands flat on either side of it. The crossword was still open in front of me. 11 letters. What remains when everything else is stripped away? I picked up my pen and wrote the answer in careful capital letters, filling in each box slowly. F-O-UN, date tie-in. Then I folded the newspaper, put the cap back on the pen, and started clearing the table for dinner. We're thinking next October. It's going to be a big wedding. Kristen's parents want to go all out. We'll be in touch about all the details soon. Of course, I said. Congratulations, sweetheart. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment. Then I picked up the pen and filled in the answer to 11 across. The word was foundation. The engagement party was in August at Kristen's parents' home in Pasadena. Her father was in real estate, and her mother was in that specific category of not quite employment that involves a great deal of activity, the charity boards, the committee positions, the organizational roles that structure a life without the structure of a paycheck. Their house was beautiful in the careful, expensive way that Kristen herself was beautiful. Nothing out of place, everything coordinated. The kind of environment that takes constant, invisible maintenance to sustain. I wore the blue dress again. It seemed appropriate. I brought a bottle of good champagne and a card with a personal note, because those were the correct things to bring. Barbara, Kristen's mother, greeted me at the door with the particular warmth that people deploy when they are performing welcome rather than feeling it. Not insincere exactly, not unkind, just professionally warm. The warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is a social lubricant and applies it smoothly to all surfaces. Margaret, so wonderful you could come. You look lovely. What a gorgeous bottle. Kristen was across the room when I arrived, talking to a group of her friends, women in their mid-30s in the specific uniform of their particular class. The kind of effortless-looking clothes that take considerable effort to choose. She excused herself and came over to greet me, and she kissed my cheek and said all the right things with the practiced ease of a woman who had been trained from childhood to say the right things. She was, genuinely, very good at this. I had always recognized that she was good at this. What I had not known until recently was what she said when no one was training her. I had found out 2 weeks earlier, by accident. Daniel had left his laptop open on my kitchen table during a Sunday visit. They came to dinner occasionally, once a month or so, and I cooked things I knew Daniel liked because that is what mothers do, and I was not yet, at that point, finished with being that kind of mother. And he'd gone outside to take a work call, and Kristen had excused herself to use the bathroom, and the laptop was there, open to a group chat, and I had glanced at it the way you glance at things that are in your line of sight, without intention. I would like to tell you I looked away immediately. I did not look away immediately. The group chat was called the Wives Club, which I noted with a distant clinical part of my brain, even as the rest of it went very still and cold. The way it went still and cold during emergencies at work. During the moments when the monitor showed something that required immediate, precise action, and panic was not useful. The most recent message was from Kristen, from 2 days prior, and it said, "Dan's mom is coming Sunday. I swear she makes everything a whole production. Last month, she showed up with this enormous casserole dish, like we don't have a kitchen. So embarrassing." Above that, from 3 weeks earlier, from someone named Ashley W., "How was the thing with his mom?" And Kristen's reply, "Tedious as always. She means well, but God, she's a lot. Dan just lets her carry on, and I have to sit there." Above that, from a month before, "Did she really ask you to call her mom?" And Kristen, "She suggested it. I told Dan later, I said, I have a mother. I don't need to audition another one." He laughed. He gets it. I read 3 months of the conversation. It took about 4 minutes. Then I stood up, closed the laptop to exactly the angle it had been at before, walked to the sink, and stood there for a moment with both hands on the edge of the counter and my eyes on the window above it, which looked out at my garden, which was in its early June fullness. everything growing toward the light, the way things do in June, when they don't know yet about July. Kristen came back from the bathroom. Daniel came in from the call. We sat down to dinner, and I served the chicken and the roasted vegetables and the bread I'd made that morning. And we talked about the wedding plans and Daniel's new client and whether the garden was getting enough water this summer. And I smiled and asked questions and refilled glasses and was, by any external measure, entirely myself. Inside, something had become very quiet. Not numb, quiet. Like a house after all the guests have left and you are the only one still there, moving through the rooms in the dark, and you know every piece of furniture by memory, so you don't need the lights. The thing about reading someone's private words is that you cannot unknow them afterward. You can decide what to do with the knowledge, but the knowledge itself is permanent. I did not rage about what I'd read. I did not cry in the bathroom while the chicken finished in the oven. I was 67 years old, and I had worked in cardiac care for 22 years, and I had been a single mother, and I had sat with people in the worst moments of their lives, and I knew the difference between pain that requires an immediate response and pain that requires sitting still until you understand its shape. I sat still. Over the weeks that followed, I paid attention in a way I hadn't before. Or rather, I paid a different kind of attention. I had always noticed things. It was in my professional nature. The observational habits of a nurse are not easily turned off. But I had been applying my attention selectively, filtering out the things that didn't fit the picture I wanted to maintain. Now I stopped filtering. I noticed that Kristen never asked me a question about myself unless Daniel was in the room. That when it was just the two of us, waiting for him to come back from wherever he'd gone, the conversation stayed on logistics, wedding details, his schedule, whether I needed directions to the engagement party. I noticed that Daniel laughed at her jokes and adopted her vocabulary and had begun, sometime in the past year, to describe things as a lot in the specific dismissive way she used the phrase. I noticed that he had not once, in the months since my graduation, asked to see my diploma or mentioned the ceremony or acknowledged the degree in any way except as a checkbox on a list of things he'd been told about. I noticed that I had been, for quite some time, performing a relationship rather than having one. This was not entirely Daniel's fault. He was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that because this story could be read as a story about a bad person, and that would be too simple. He was a person who had found someone he loved and had gradually, in the ordinary way that people do, organized his life around her center of gravity. His loyalties had reordered themselves. That was natural. What was less natural, what was the specific failure I had to sit with, was that the reordering had included a reclassification of me. From mother, from person, from the woman who had held his life together for 19 years alone, into an obligation, a management task, something to be handled with periodic dinners and birthday calls and the specific minimum of attention required to avoid guilt. He hadn't done this cruelly. He'd done it the way people do most things that hurt other people, without thinking about it very much. And because I hadn't said anything, because I had filtered and accepted and adjusted and not pushed back, because I had been the kind of mother who made things easy and smooth and didn't require maintenance, he had not had the necessary friction to notice. That was going to change, but not yet, not urgently. I had time. At the engagement party, I drank 2 glasses of champagne and ate the past appetizers and made conversation with Kristen's aunt from Seattle, who was funny and loud and refreshingly unconcerned with maintaining any particular impression. I met the bridesmaids, a group of women who looked at me with the polite, slightly glazed attention that people give to others who exist in a category they don't have to worry about. I said congratulations to Daniel's future father-in-law, who shook my hand with both of his and said, "We're so glad Daniel found Kristen. She is absolutely remarkable, that girl." And I agreed that she was, and I meant it. In the particular way you can mean something that is also an understatement. At one point, I found myself standing near the kitchen doorway with a fresh glass of champagne, not quite in the party and not quite out of it, in one of those social negative spaces that form in any gathering, and that I have always found oddly comfortable. From that angle, I could see Daniel across the room, his arm around Kristen's shoulder, laughing at something her father had said. He looked happy. He looked specifically like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, surrounded by people who reflected back to him a version of himself he preferred. I watched him for a moment, my son, who had my mother's coloring and his father's height, and 39 years of my work and love and sacrifice woven into his bones like mortar. And I thought, you will not know I'm disappointed until I am ready for you to know. And then I will make sure you understand it completely. I drove home that night through the Glendale streets I'd known for 30 years. The same route I'd driven back from the hospital on night shifts for 2 decades, and I thought about the wedding. October was 14 months away. I had 14 months to decide exactly what I wanted to do with what I knew, and 14 months to do it correctly. And I am a planner by nature and by profession, and by the specific discipline of a woman who has had to be her own safety net for most of her adult life. I started by calling Ruth the next morning. "You need to hear something," I said when she answered, "and then I need you to tell me I'm not overreacting." Ruth came over that afternoon and I made coffee, the good kind, the beans from the place on Brand Boulevard that she'd introduced me to 3 years ago and that I now considered non-negotiable. And we sat at the kitchen table, which is where we have sat for most of our important conversations over the years, and I told her everything. The graduation, the text message, the 3-day silence, the Instagram photographs time-stamped 3:47, the laptop, Kristen's group chat, all of it, in order, the way I would have given a patient history. Clear, precise, nothing left out, no editorializing until I was done with the facts. Ruth listened without interrupting. This is one of her great qualities. She has the stillness of someone who was a nurse for 30 years and learned that the most important thing you can do for another person is stay quiet long enough to hear what they're actually saying. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her coffee cup held in both hands, looking at the table. The late afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the wood in long stripes, the way it does in October when the sun is lower. "Show me the Instagram post," she said finally. I got my phone and pulled it up. The photographs were still there. Kristen had never deleted them. Ruth looked at them for a moment, her reading glasses on, her face composed. Then she handed the phone back without comment. "And the chat," she said, "the one on his laptop. I don't have a screenshot. I didn't think to take one." "You remember what it said." "Word for word," I said. Ruth set her coffee cup down. "Read it to me." I did. I said the words precisely because I had said them to myself many times in the weeks since, and they had not blurred. When I finished, Ruth was quiet again. Her jaw had the particular set it gets when she is deciding something. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to go to the wedding," I said. "I'm going to be a wonderful guest. I'll sit at the family table and eat the salmon and compliment Barbara on the centerpieces and dance if there's dancing. I'm going to be exactly the mother they expect me to be. Ruth waited. And at some point during the gift opening, I said, my son is going to open an envelope with my return address on it. And inside that envelope, there is going to be a card. What does the card say? I haven't written it yet, I said, but I know what it's going to say. I'm going to write exactly what he wrote to me in May. 3 words. Ruth's eyes found mine across the table. Say them. I simply forgot. The kitchen was very still. Ruth looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone running calculations she isn't sure she wants to complete. Margaret, she said, I know. That's very cold. Yes, I said, it is. He's your son. I know that too. Another silence. Ruth picked up her coffee and held it without drinking. Outside, someone drove past on the street with their window down, music briefly audible and then gone. She said, Are you angry? I thought about it honestly. I was, I said, in May and June and for part of July. Now I'm something else. I'm clear. It's different. Clear about what? Clear about the fact that he made a choice. He chose that dinner table over my graduation, and then he lied to me about why. And then he called me 3 days later expecting everything to be fine because he said sorry. And Kristen has been calling me embarrassing in group chats while I sit in her mother's living room eating little sandwiches and saying the right things. I set my own cup down. I have been very easy to overlook, Ruth, for a long time. I'd like to be less easy. Ruth set her coffee cup down with a small, deliberate click. She looked at me across the table, and there was something in her expression that was not quite approval and not quite disapproval, and might have been recognition. The look of a woman who has had her own long experience with the gap between what you absorb quietly and what you should have said. What about the money? She said. You told me last year you'd been saving something for his wedding. I have, $12,000, $200 a month since he graduated from college. Ruth raised her eyebrows. And? That money is going to my granddaughter's college fund, when I have a granddaughter. In the meantime, it stays in the account. She was quiet, turning this over. That's not small, she said. No. He's going to notice. Yes, that's rather the point. And Kristen will know that something is different, I said. She doesn't need to know the details. Daniel will know the details. That's sufficient. Ruth picked up her coffee cup again and drank from it slowly. Then she put it down and folded her hands on the table, the way she folds her hands when she's made up her mind about something. All right, she said. What do you need from me? I need you to tell me I'm not being a monster. She thought about it for a genuine moment, which I appreciated more than a quick reassurance. Ruth has never been the kind of friend who reassures reflexively. She gave it real consideration, her eyes on the middle distance, her hands still on the table. Then she said, You're not being a monster. You're being a woman who's been very patient for a very long time and who has decided to stop. That's what I thought, I said. I didn't say it was the only right choice. I know, but it's mine. She nodded once, the single nod that means she's with you even if she's not entirely certain. Then I'm with you, she said. Obviously. Do you need me to be there? No, I said. This is between me and Daniel. And Kristen. And Kristen, I agreed. Indirectly. Ruth picked up her cup again, found it empty, and stood to refill it from the pot on the counter. With her back to me, she said, You know, the hardest part isn't the wedding. I know. The hardest part is the 14 months between now and then. She poured, set the pot down, turned around. 14 months of Sunday dinners and phone calls and being exactly the mother they expect you to be. I'm aware. That's going to cost you something. Yes, I said, it is. She sat back down and wrapped both hands around the fresh cup. Well, she said, you've always been good at playing a long game. 39 years of night shifts, I said. You learn patience. Ruth almost smiled. Almost. You're something else, Margaret Calloway, she said. I know, I said. I'm starting to think that's not a bad thing to be. That was enough. That was, actually, exactly enough. I spent the next 12 months being, as I had promised Ruth, entirely normal. I attended the dress fittings, not mine, I wasn't in the wedding party, but I was invited to 2 of Kristen's fittings as a courtesy, and I went, and I said the right things, and I meant some of them, because Kristen was genuinely beautiful in the dress, which was ivory with an architectural neckline that required the kind of posture Kristen maintained as a matter of course. I attended the bridal shower in March, brought a present from the registry, the Le Creuset Dutch oven they'd listed, the expensive one, and I sat in Kristen's mother's living room with the assembled women of Kristen's life, and I played the games and ate the little sandwiches and watched my future daughter-in-law unwrap 37 gifts with the practiced grace of someone who had been anticipating this particular performance her entire adult life. I helped Daniel pick out the wedding gift for Kristen's parents. He called me in July, slightly stressed, because apparently there was an expectation that the groom's family would give the bride's parents a, quote, significant gesture. And he wasn't sure what the right move was, and he trusted my taste. We spent a Saturday morning on the phone going through options. I suggested a piece from a gallery in Pasadena that I knew Barbara would appreciate, and he ordered it on my recommendation, and when it was received, Barbara sent a handwritten note that Daniel forwarded to me with the subject line, "See, you always know the right thing." I did always know the right thing. I had spent 68 years knowing the right thing. It was, perhaps, the truest thing Daniel had ever said about me, and he had said it without noticing that it was true. In September, a month before the wedding, I wrote the card. I sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with a cup of tea and the small box of note card stationery I kept in the desk. Cream-colored, my initials embossed at the top, a birthday gift from Ruth years ago. And I thought for a while about what I wanted to say, and then I wrote it. I wrote 3 words, the same 3 words, in my neatest, most careful handwriting, the kind I developed in nursing school when illegibility could cause harm. Then I put the card in the envelope. I sealed the envelope. I wrote my return address in the upper left corner, the way I'd been taught. I put the envelope in the desk drawer next to the stationery box, and I went to bed. I slept perfectly well. I had expected not to. Expected some version of the sleeplessness that accompanies major decisions, the turning over and re-examination, the 3 a.m. second-guessing. Instead, I slept 8 hours without waking, which I took as information. The wedding was on the second Saturday in October at a venue in Malibu that involved a cliffside and a view of the Pacific, and a catering operation of a scale that I had last seen at a hospital fundraiser. 212 guests, $300 a head, according to a figure I'd overheard at the rehearsal dinner the previous evening, which I'd attended at a beachside restaurant in Santa Monica while wearing the blue dress again, because I had decided the blue dress was the dress for occasions in this particular story, and I was going to be consistent about it. The rehearsal dinner had been its own exercise in observation. I sat between Daniel's college roommate and a woman from Kristen's office, and I was pleasant and interested and asked good questions, and across the table I watched Daniel and Kristen move through the evening as a unit, the seamless, coordinated efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms. They were, I'll give them this, genuinely well matched. They were the same kind of person. They had the same values, the same aesthetics, the same calibration of what mattered and what could be managed. He had found his person. I believed that sincerely. It didn't change anything else, but I believed it. At one point during dessert, Daniel came to sit beside me while Kristen was across the room with her parents, and he said, "I'm glad you're here, Mom. Kristen's family can be kind of a lot. It's nice to have my person on my side." I looked at him. He was 42 years old, and he still had the particular quality he'd had as a boy, an openness in his face when he was relaxed, a look of someone who believes the room is basically safe. He had not always had an easy time of it. There had been years of struggle, professional and personal, and I had been there for all of them, in the ways I could be, and some of the ways I couldn't. And I loved him with the specific, undimmed love that does not require its object to be perfect or even consistently good. "I'm glad to be here," I said, and that was true too. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "Big day tomorrow," I agreed. He squeezed my hand once and went back across the room, and I watched him go, and I thought, I know you. I know you better than you know me, and tomorrow you are going to learn something about me that you should have known a long time ago. The ceremony was beautiful. The cliffside, the Pacific light, the string quartet. It was the kind of wedding that exists in the register of events that are genuinely magnificent, regardless of what surrounds them. The vows were personal and well-written. Kristen cried in the precise, photogenic way that some people have, and Daniel held her hands and looked at her with an expression I recognized, which was the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck. That expression I did not have complicated feelings about. That expression was simply true. I sat in the family section in the blue dress with my hands folded and my back straight, and I watched my son get married, and I felt the full weight of it, the 39 years, the night shifts, the empty chair in May, the laptop on the kitchen table, the Instagram photograph time-stamped 3:47. I felt all of it simultaneously, the love and the grief and the cold, clear anger, all of it present and distinct, and none of it obscuring the others. When it was over, when the recessional had played and the applause had settled, and the 212 guests had moved toward the cocktail reception on the terrace, I went to the gift table. It was near the entrance, arranged with the precision of a display, gifts stacked and organized, a specific aesthetic of abundance. I placed my envelope in the center, where it would be among the first things seen. White, sealed, my return address in the upper left corner. Then I stepped back and straightened my dress and went to find the bar. The cocktail hour was good. I talked to Daniel's college roommate, Mark, who I'd always liked, a solid, unflashy man who had known Daniel before the Silver Lake apartment and the clients and Kristen's mother's living room. And we talked for a long time about his kids and his job and the general state of things, and it was easy and real in the way conversations are when neither person is performing. I talked to Kristen's aunt from Seattle again, the loud, funny one, who was drinking martinis at a pace that suggested the evening was going to get more interesting as it progressed. I talked to two of Daniel's work colleagues, and to Barbara's sister, and to a woman named Diane who had gone to college with Kristen and was, she told me, writing a novel about a woman who discovers her entire marriage has been a financial scam, which she described as loosely autobiographical, and then laughed for a long time. Daniel found me during the cocktail hour, while Kristen was occupied with photographs. He hugged me and said I looked beautiful, and asked if I was having a good time, and I said yes and meant it, and he said, "This is really something, isn't it?" with a sweep of his hand that took in the terrace and the Pacific and the entire magnificent, expensive occasion. And I said, "It really is something, Daniel." And that was also true. We went into dinner. I was at the family table, as I'd been told to expect, between Mark's wife Sandra and one of Daniel's cousins. The table was round and beautifully set, and the food was exceptional. There are things about money that are genuinely good, and professional catering is one of them. I ate the salmon and the roasted vegetables, and I drank one glass of the red wine, which was very good, and I watched the room the way I had been watching rooms for 39 years, not from suspicion, but from the professional habit of knowing who is where and what is happening. The gift opening happened after dinner, before dancing, which is unusual. Most couples open gifts privately afterward, but Kristen's mother had organized a formal gift opening because, Barbara had explained to me at the rehearsal dinner with a smile that didn't entirely reach her eyes, Kristen has always felt that the gift is a moment of connection, not just a transaction. I understood this to mean that Barbara wanted the assembled guests to witness the generosity that surrounded her daughter. They were seated at a table at the front of the room, Kristen and Daniel, and a bridesmaid sat beside them with a notebook to record who gave what for the thank you notes. The gifts were brought to them one at a time, or sometimes in groups, and they opened each one and held it up and responded with the appropriate warmth and specificity. Kristen was very good at this. She had a gift, if you'll forgive the word, for making each giver feel that their particular present had been the most thoughtful, the most perfectly chosen of all. I watched this, and I noted it, and I thought, she is not untalented. She is genuinely skilled at the management of people's feelings. What she lacks is sincerity. But sincerity is not always required for skill. Halfway through the opening, Daniel reached for the white envelope. I saw him register it, the weight of it, or lack thereof, with a small flicker of something across his face. He turned it to read the return address. He looked up, scanning the room, and his eyes found me, and I gave him a small, steady smile from across the table, and he smiled back, a little uncertain, and then he turned back to the envelope. The room was loud with ambient dinner party sound. Not everyone was watching the gift table. People were in conversation, refilling glasses, the natural ebb and flow of a reception. But enough people were watching, including Barbara, who had positioned herself to my right with a champagne flute and the concentrated attention of a stage manager, and Kristen's aunt from Seattle, who had finished her martinis and moved to wine and was now watching proceedings with bright, interested eyes, and Mark and Sandra, who were at my table and had therefore seen me watching the envelope travel to the front of the room. Daniel opened the envelope with one finger under the flap, the way you open an envelope when you're not sure what's inside. He took out the card. He read it. The change in his face was not dramatic. That's the thing about real moments. They're rarely as theatrical as you imagine them. His expression shifted the way ice shifts on a river in early spring, not breaking all at once, but moving, the structure becoming different from what it had been, a rearrangement of certainties. He looked at the card for a long moment. Then he looked up, and his eyes found me again across the room, and this time there was nothing uncertain in his expression. I held his gaze. I did not look away. I did not smile. Kristen said beside him, "What is it?" in a bright social voice, reaching for the card, and Daniel's hand moved just slightly to keep it in his grip, and he said, "Just a card from my mom," in a voice that was doing careful, effortful work to sound normal. I raised my wine glass in a small, private gesture. He saw it. His jaw tightened in the way I remembered from his adolescence, the specific jaw clench of a person who has been caught in something and is processing the implications. Then he put the card in his jacket pocket without showing it to Kristen, without showing it to the room, and the bridesmaid with the notebook wrote something, and Daniel reached for the next gift, and the moment moved on the way moments do, absorbed into the ongoing forward motion of the occasion. But he kept touching the pocket where the card was. I watched him do it 3 times in the next 20 minutes. The unconscious hand to the jacket pocket, the brief pressure of fingers against the card through the fabric. He knew what was in it. He would have known the moment he read it. I simply forgot. He would have heard in those 3 words the echo of his own text message from May. He would have understood because Daniel is not unintelligent. He is, in many ways, quite smart, that this was not an accident or a coincidence. He would have understood that I had remembered. I danced at the reception as I'd promised myself. Mark asked me first, which was kind of him, and then one of Daniel's cousins, and then, unexpectedly, Kristen's aunt from Seattle, who danced with the exuberant freedom of a woman who has decided not to care what she looks like, which I found genuinely delightful. The music was good, the dancing was good. At some point, standing at the edge of the dance floor with a glass of water while the band took a break, I became aware of Daniel standing beside me. He didn't speak immediately. We stood together looking at the dance floor, the guests reassembling, the band members returning to their positions, the lights warm and low over everything. It was a beautiful wedding. That was still true. "Mom," he said finally. "Yes?" Another pause. Then, "I didn't know you were still... I thought you were okay." I turned to look at him. He was looking at the dance floor, not at me, his hands in his pockets and the specific posture of a man who is choosing his words with unusual care. "Were you?" he said. "Okay?" "No," I said. "I wasn't okay." He was quiet. "I walked across that stage," I said, "and there was an empty chair. I walked across that stage in front of 800 people with an empty chair where my son was supposed to be sitting. And then you texted me that work came up, and that night you were at Nobu." He was very still. "I saw the photos, Daniel." The timestamp was 3:47. He looked at me then, finally, and the expression on his face was not the defensive blankness I had half expected, but something more complicated and more interesting. A person meeting something true about themselves that they have been avoiding. The particular quality of recognition that looks a lot like pain. "I didn't," he started, and then stopped. He tried again. "I didn't think it mattered as much as..." "I know," I said. "That's what the card is for." The band started up again, something slow and romantic, and the dance floor filled again around us. We stood in our small pocket of stillness at the edge of it, and I could feel him wanting to say something that would resolve this, the way he'd been resolving things his whole life, with a phone call and an apology, and the brightness that people bring when they're used to being forgiven. "The card," he said quietly. "There wasn't a check." "No," I said, "there wasn't." He absorbed this. "I'd told Kristen..." "I know what you'd told Kristen," I said. "You can tell her that things came up." His jaw tightened, not dramatically, a small movement, the kind you learn to read after 4 decades of watching people receive difficult information. He looked at the dance floor again for a moment, then back at me, and I could see him making the decision to go further, the way you see someone decide to step off a curb. "Mom, the money. It's in an account. For your children's education," I said. "When you have children, it will be there." He absorbed this slowly, the way you absorb something that confirms what you'd feared. That was supposed to be... I'd told Kristen there would be a check. She's going to ask. Then you can explain it to her, I said. You're good at explaining things. There was a silence that was not comfortable, and was not entirely uncomfortable either. Something more honest than either of those. The band had shifted into something slower, couples drifting together on the dance floor, the light warm and amber over everything. Kristen, somewhere across the room, surrounded by her bridesmaids and her mother, and the beautiful scaffolding of the life she'd built with great care and deliberate intention. I should have been there, Daniel said. Not the way he'd said it on the phone, 3 days after May, with the brightness of a man managing a situation. He said it the way you say something when you have finally stopped managing it. His voice was flat and tired and certain, the voice of a person looking directly at a thing. Yes, I said, you should have. I don't. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I don't have a good reason. That's what I've been sitting with. I keep trying to build one and I can't. We just went to dinner. I don't know what I thought, that you'd be fine. I was fine, I said. That's not the same as it being all right. He looked at me then with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager and had done something genuinely, unambiguously wrong and knew it and had no defense and was standing in the kitchen waiting for me to tell him what came next. He had been, even then, better at receiving truth than most people. I had always respected that about him. It had made the last 14 months more complicated, because I could not persuade myself he was simply a person incapable of understanding. He was perfectly capable. He had just been choosing not to look. The card, he said quietly. You planned that. Since September. He processed this. The whole time, all of it, the dinners, the fittings, helping me pick the gift for her parents. Yes. You were being exactly the mother you expected me to be, I said, which it turns out is quite easy when you understand what's expected. Another silence. Longer this time. On the dance floor, someone laughed at something, a bright sound that floated up and over us. Daniel's hand moved to his jacket pocket, touched the card through the fabric, and came back down. What happens now, he said. That depends on you, I said, largely. What do you need from me? The question surprised me slightly, not because it was wrong, but because it was the right question, and I hadn't expected him to arrive at it so quickly. I considered it the way I try to consider things that deserve consideration, genuinely, without rushing to the answer I'd prepared. I need you to know me, I said, not manage me. Know me. There's a difference, and you've known the difference your whole life, and you stopped applying it sometime in the last few years, and I need you to start again. He nodded once, slowly, the kind of nod that means I hear you, and I am not going to dispute it, and I understand this is going to require something of me. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. It's a beautiful wedding, Daniel, I said. Go be with your wife. He went. I watched him cross the dance floor and find Kristen, who looked up with a question on her face. I watched them exchange a few words, his head bent toward hers, something passing between them that I was not meant to hear. His hand went to his jacket pocket one more time. I watched Kristen's expression move through something, not anger, something more careful than anger. And then she looked across the room, not quite at me, but in my direction. And I raised my wine glass very slightly, and she looked away first. That was all. That was the whole thing in terms of external events. Internally, it was somewhat more complex. But I had done it correctly, I thought. I had done it with precision and at the right moment and without cruelty. I want to be clear about the distinction. What I had done was not cruel. Cruel would have been a scene. Cruel would have been a public speech or a confrontation or the revelation of the laptop chat to an audience. What I had done was private and small and pointed. A message delivered specifically to the recipient in a language he would understand, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. I had told him, I was there. I noticed. I remember. I had told him, things that matter to me are not erasable by a text message. I had told him, you taught me something last May about what happens when you forget something important. I applied the lesson. The blue dress and I drove home in the small hours of Sunday morning through the Glendale streets, and I felt tired in the good way. The way you feel after completing something that required a significant output of careful energy. My heels were in the passenger seat. My hair had come down from where I'd put it up that morning. The city moved past the windows in the orange-lit California dark. I had not told Ruth the exact timing of when I'd planned to deploy the card. She knew the plan, but not the specific logistics, and she texted me as I pulled into the driveway. How did it go? I sat in the parked car and typed back, I'll tell you Tuesday. She sent back a single period, which from Ruth is the equivalent of a standing ovation. I am writing this 14 months later, which is long enough for things to have settled into their proper shapes. Daniel called me on the Monday after the wedding. He was composed in the way that people are when they've spent a night deciding to be composed, the specific calm of a decision rather than an absence of feeling. He said, I want to talk about what happened. I said, all right. He came over the following Wednesday, alone, which told me something about the conversations that had apparently happened between him and Kristen, conversations I was not privy to and did not try to be. And we sat at the kitchen table, which is where we've sat for everything that mattered in our shared life, and he talked for a long time. He said he knew he'd been wrong about May. He said he'd been wrong about more than May, that he understood. And here he stopped and started a few times, which told me the understanding was genuine and not performed, that he'd let her priorities and her family's rhythms override his sense of where I fit, that he'd been managing me rather than knowing me, that he hadn't thought about how it would feel from where I was standing. He said, I think I've been treating you like someone who doesn't need anything instead of someone who doesn't ask for much. That was the most accurate thing he had ever said about our relationship, and I sat with it for a moment before I responded. I said, that's right. And then I said, I'm not angry with you, Daniel. I want you to understand that. I'm not going to be angry with you. But I need you to know that things are different now. I know things I didn't know before, and you know things you didn't know before, and we have to go forward from that. He asked about the money. I told him the money was in an account for his eventual children's education, which was where it was going to stay, and I told him why I'd made that decision. And I watched his face go through several things while I explained, and at the end he was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said finally. Okay, I said. He did not cry. I did not cry. We sat together in the kitchen for another hour, and we talked about other things, necessary and ordinary things. And when he left, he hugged me in the doorway longer than usual, not with the brief, one-armed efficiency of a son who is moving through a checklist, but with both arms and some actual duration, the hug of a person who is trying to say something they don't yet have the vocabulary for. I let him. Kristen and I have not had a direct conversation about anything that happened. I don't expect that we will. She is not going to bring it up, and I'm not going to bring it up. And we have reached, in the months since, a kind of recalibrated arrangement. She is careful with me in a way she wasn't before, and I am honest with her in a way I wasn't before, and neither of us pretends that we are something we're not, which is an improvement. She is going to be the mother of my grandchildren. That is a permanent fact, and I have chosen to build on it. There are worse foundations. In March, Daniel came to dinner alone. Kristen was at her mother's for the weekend. And while I was cooking, he sat at the kitchen table and talked to me the way he used to talk to me when he was in college. The specifics of what he was thinking about and what was worrying him and what he wanted. The kind of conversation that had gotten gradually rarer over the years and whose absence I had stopped noticing. Afterward, he helped me do the dishes, which he hadn't done since he was a teenager. And while we were standing at the sink, he said, without quite looking at me, "Mom, that thing you did at the wedding." I waited. "It was really something," he said. He was almost smiling, the complicated half smile of someone who has had time to locate the thing that was fair in something that hurt. "You really just, you waited, and then you—" "I simply forgot," I said. He looked at me then, fully, and the half smile became something more complete and more rueful. "Yeah," he said. "You did. So did you," I said, and then we both remembered. He was quiet for a moment, drying the pot in his hands with more thoroughness than the task required. "I'm sorry about May," he said. "I'm really sorry. I didn't know how much it meant." "I know you didn't," I said. "You know now." He put the pot away in the correct cabinet, which is something he'd always had to be told. Then he folded the dish towel with the precision of someone paying close attention to a small task. "The diploma," he said. "Can I see it?" I went to the study and took it down from the wall where I'd hung it in September, the real leather-covered one, my name in proper calligraphy, the college seal, the signatures, and I brought it out and set it on the kitchen table. He picked it up and held it the way you hold something you should have held much sooner, with a care that is also an acknowledgement. "Margaret Ann Calloway," he read, "Bachelor of Science in Health Sciences." He looked up. 11 months. 11 months, I said. He set it down gently. "You're something else," he said. "I am," I agreed. That was 6 months ago. He calls twice a week now, real calls, not the 5-minute check-in variety. He came to my birthday dinner in June with a reservation at a restaurant I'd mentioned once in passing, which meant he'd written it down somewhere, which meant he'd been paying attention. Kristen came too, and she was, as she always is, competent and coordinated and correct. And I was, as I always am, exactly myself, and it was fine. It was genuinely fine. On a Sunday morning last month, I was in my garden. The bougainvillea coming back, the roses in their fall bloom, the ordinary seasonal business of a garden that has been kept up for 30 years. And I was drinking coffee in the good chair I'd bought myself in May with part of the birthday money from Ruth. A proper outdoor chair with cushions in a particular shade of gold, because I had decided after 68 years that I was allowed to have a nice chair. And I was thinking about nothing in particular, just the garden and the coffee and the clear California morning, when my phone buzzed. It was a photograph from Daniel, a framed picture, sitting on a shelf in his living room. I recognized the shelf from the times I'd been in his apartment. The photograph was the one Ruth had taken at my graduation. Me in the black gown and mortarboard, holding the diploma in both hands, looking directly at the camera with the expression I'd finally recognized as my own. Below the photograph he'd written, "Put it up last week. Thought you should know." I sat with that for a moment, the coffee warm in my hands, the bougainvillea doing its aggressive pink-purple thing along the back fence. Then I typed back, "I see it. Thank you." I put the phone down on the arm of the good gold chair. The sun was climbing, and the garden was doing what gardens do, everything growing toward the light in the way of all living things that have what they need. I sat there for a long time, just sitting, which is something I'm learning to do without guilt, without the sense that stillness is time being wasted. It is not wasted. It is, in fact, precisely the point. The coffee was still warm. The morning was very clear. And somewhere across town, in a living room in Silver Lake, there was a photograph of me on a shelf, diploma in my hands, looking like a woman who had finished something important and was just getting started on everything else. Although, no, that is not quite the end of the story. That would be too neat, too rounded off, too much like a moral I'm telling myself. The truth is more complicated than that. The truth is that in March, 3 weeks before the dinner when Daniel came alone and washed the dishes and asked to see the diploma, I spent a night I wouldn't include in the version of this story I'd tell a stranger. 3 a.m, kitchen table, an unopened bottle of wine beside me because I wanted to drink and decided not to, because 3 a.m. is not the time for decisions made under the influence of anything. I sat there and thought about whether I'd done the right thing. Not with the envelope. With the envelope, I was at peace. I was thinking about something earlier, that I could have spoken, could have demanded a conversation, could have, that evening in May when I received the text and saw the Instagram photograph time-stamped 3:47, called Daniel and said, I need you to explain this to me, directly and immediately. I didn't do that. I chose a different path, patient, precise, costly in terms of the emotional labor that 12 months of normality over hidden disappointment requires. Was my way the right way? I don't know. That is the only honest answer. The outcome, Daniel calling twice a week, the photograph on his shelf, might have been reached differently, through a direct conversation in June, through clear words instead of 3 words in an envelope, less theater and more vulnerability. I don't rule that out. I am a person who waits and plans and acts at the exact moment because that is how my life shaped me. Nurses develop that precision because in medicine, the moment of action is everything. But human relationships are not medicine, and sometimes the better instrument is not precision, but directness. Maybe if I had cried on the phone with Daniel in May, maybe if I had said, I am in a great deal of pain, not cleverly, not coldly, not strategically, just, I am in pain, you let me down, and you lied to me, and I need to understand why. Maybe we would have arrived at the same place in less time and with less collateral damage. Maybe. But that is not how I am built. I do what I know how to do. And 68 years old is not the age at which you begin redesigning your fundamental architecture. At 68, you learn to know yourself rather than change. That is its own kind of wisdom, even if not the most elegant kind. What I know with certainty, on that November night at 3 a.m. at the kitchen table, I gave myself permission not to regret. Not because everything was done perfectly, but because it was done. Because I did not stay entirely silent. Because the empty chair in May could have remained simply an empty chair, one of those wounds a woman like me collects and sorts and files away, because otherwise there is no way to manage them. Instead, the empty chair became a point of reference, the beginning of a conversation that should have begun long before. Sometimes justice is not about punishing another person. Sometimes justice is finally allowing yourself to be a person who cannot be conveniently overlooked, who cannot be easily forgotten the next time. In April, Kristen invited me to lunch, just the 2 of us, without Daniel. A French cafe in Los Feliz that she'd chosen herself. Good light, quiet enough to talk, the kind of place that signals effort without announcing it. I wore the blue dress because at this point, the blue dress had become something of a talisman, and I saw no reason to break the pattern. We ordered salads and sparkling water, and the silence after the waiter left had a particular quality. The silence of two people who have both prepared for a conversation and are deciding who goes first. I had decided, before I arrived, that it would be her. This was her invitation. Whatever she needed to say, she had earned the right to say it first. She rearranged her fork, then her water glass. Then she said, "Daniel told me what was in the card." "I thought he might," I said. "He also told me about the money." She looked at her plate. "Or the absence of it." "Yes." A pause. She picked up her water glass, set it down without drinking. Outside on the street, two women walked past with a stroller and a large dog, and through the cafe window the scene had the unreal brightness of a life happening in good weather. "I owe you an apology," Kristen said. She said it with the precision of someone who has rehearsed it enough to say it cleanly, without fumbling, but not so much that it has lost its weight. "For things I said, in private, that were unkind." I looked at her. She was looking at me now, and her face had that quality again, the one I'd glimpsed at the wedding, the younger, less finished version of herself that appeared when she dropped the register she usually maintained. "You know about the chat," she said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I saw it by accident," I said. "Daniel's laptop. He'd left it open." She closed her eyes briefly. "How long ago?" "Before the engagement party." Something moved across her face. The math of it working its way through. The engagement party, the bridal shower, the fittings, the rehearsal dinner, the wedding itself. 14 months of salads and compliments and the perfect mother-in-law performance, all of it occurring after I already knew. She opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite fear and was somewhere between the two. "You never said anything," she said. "No." "Why?" I considered how to answer this honestly without making it into a speech. "Because the wedding wasn't the right moment," I said. "The card was the right moment. And then, this is the right moment. Things have their time." She was quiet. She cut a small piece of her salad and ate it carefully, the way people eat when they're thinking about something other than the food. Then she said, "The things I said, about you being embarrassing, being a lot." She paused. "They were unkind. And not entirely accurate. I was venting. I say things in that chat I don't fully mean." "I know," I said. "I've done the same. Everyone has." "But you read it." "Yes." "And it mattered." "Yes," I said. "It did." Another silence. She folded her hands on the table with the deliberate tidiness that was characteristic of her and said, "I want us to have a real relationship, not a managed one. I've been treating you the way I treat things that make me nervous, which is to keep them at a distance and be very polished about it." "I noticed," I said, not unkindly, as a fact. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I thought you might have." She picked up her water glass, this time actually drinking from it. "My own mother and I are very close. I didn't know how to have another mother, especially one who'd done so much alone. It made me feel judged, maybe, even when you weren't judging me." "I wasn't," I said, "judging you. I know that now." She held my eyes steadily. "I didn't know it then." "I appreciate you saying this," I said, "and I mean that without reservation. I'm not going to pretend the last year didn't happen. I'm not built for that kind of pretending. But I'm not interested in carrying it forward either. I'd rather start from here." "From here," she repeated. from here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "What was it like, walking across that stage?" I looked at her. The question was genuine. I could tell by the quality of the waiting behind it. "It was the longest walk I've ever taken," I said, "and the best." She nodded slowly, filing that away somewhere careful. "I'm sorry we weren't there," she said. Then more quietly, "I'm sorry I let that happen." I held her gaze for a long moment. She didn't look away. "Thank you," I said. "That's enough." We finished our salads. We talked about Portugal and a novel we'd both read and found overrated, which made her laugh, a real laugh, not a social one. By the time the coffee came, we had found something that felt like its own tentative shape, different from what had come before. When we were leaving, at the entrance while she gathered her coat, she said without looking at me, "I know we didn't start in the best way." "No," I agreed, "we didn't. I'd like to change that, if you're willing." I looked at her. The effort showing through the polish, the structural beams visible through good plaster if you know where to look. "I'm willing," I said. She looked at me then, and something in her face opened into something younger and less defended. "Good," she said. "Good," I said. We walked out into the April street. Jasmine somewhere nearby, that particular Los Angeles smell of blossoms and exhaust and warm asphalt that I have breathed my whole life and that still, after 68 years, registers as home. We said goodbye at the curb, and she walked to her car and I walked to mine, and it was not an ending and not a beginning, but something else, the specific thing that exists in the space between what was and what might be. Ruth, whom I told about the lunch that same evening over the phone, listened and was quiet for a moment the way she always is, and then said, "You didn't forgive her?" "I don't know," I said. "I'm being fair to her." "Those are different things." "I know," I said. "For now, fair is enough." Ruth said, "Yes, I suppose it is." My diploma hangs on the wall of the study. Below it, Ruth put a small photograph in a frame, the same one Daniel now keeps on his shelf, printed on the day I came to her with the question, "Am I a monster?" And she said, "No, you're just a woman who was patient for a very long time and decided to stop." I look at that photograph sometimes, in the mornings, when I pass by with my coffee. A woman in a black gown holding a diploma in both hands, looking directly into the camera. 67 years old, back straight. The expression of someone who has just reached the end of something long and is already looking ahead. The empty chair in May did not become my verdict. It became, as it turned out, a permission. Permission to finally take up space, loudly, clearly, memorably enough that no one would forget again. I drank my coffee in the gold chair in my garden. The bougainvillea bloomed the way it does when it has decided to make a point about existing. The morning was quiet and entirely mine.